Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on best practices for inclusive messaging. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Adedoyin Adeshina from Baylor College of Medicine, and I will be moderating this session with Dr. Nkeli Davis from Emory. We want to take this opportunity to just thank all our sponsors and leadership and members of the Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in the EM and Association of Academic Chairs of Emergency Medicine for supporting it. And thank you everyone for being here. Today's session, we will explore the critical role that effective and inclusive communication plays during times of crisis. Now, times of crisis can be personal, right? Or something that's happening locally or regionally or global. And some of the examples we can think of include hate crimes against certain groups, public health outbreaks, natural disasters, acts of terrorism, controversial legislation, just any situation that creates uncertainty and unrest. Our goal today is to provide you with some practical tools and insight that will empower you to lead with empathy, clarity, and inclusivity. As leaders, or whatever stage that you're in, the words we choose and the message that we convey can significantly impact our team, our communication. They can provide comfort, inspire action, it can build trust, and they can also do the opposite if it's not done well. So it becomes very essential for us to craft the right kind of message that not only addresses the situation, but also resonates with a diverse audience. So we are thrilled to introduce our team of experts today who will guide us through the nuances of messaging in challenging times. We also will hear real life cases, engage in some discussion, Q&A session that you can ask our panelists. So we're gonna go through some community agreement. This is a safe and brave space. Be willing to be vulnerable. We create an environment where we foster discussion, we listen with compassion, share your views, and do not criticize. Be respectful of all participant opinions. There are specific events that the panelists are not going to be able to comment on due to its sensitive nature. Question and answers will be private, and it would only be viewed by the moderators and the panelists, who will now summarize it openly for everyone to hear. There are no financial disclosure. And just general disclosure, the opinions expressed belong to the panelists and are not derived from, their institution. Is derived from their individual experiences and not necessarily representing views of their respective institution. Okay, now let's go ahead and start by introducing our panelists. Today we have Dr. L.A. Alvarez, who is Associate Professor from Stanford. He's a national leader and educator on wellness and diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion, Clinical Associate Professor of EM and Director of Wellbeing at Stanford. He also co-leads the Human Potential team, and he works and focuses on humanizing physician roles as individual teams by harnessing individual human potential in the context of high performance team. We also have Dr. Edgardo Ordonez, who's an associate professor of emergency and internal medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He is the director of the Health Equity and Community Engagement of the Henry J. N. Taub Department of Emergency Medicine. Nationally, he is the immediate past president of Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine, and he serves on various national DI committees. His academic interests includes diversity in the physician workforce, healthcare delivery, health equity, social determinants of health, and mentorship. Lastly, we have Dr. Katrina Gipson. She's an assistant professor of emergency medicine at Emory University School of Medicine. She's also a thought leader in health equity and diverse inclusion. Dr. Gipson is an avid writer whose op-ed has been featured in many national media platforms, New York Times, the Boston Globe, Progressive Magazine, and the likes. Dr. Gipson is a national leader in emergency medicine, serving as a secretary for the emergency medicine section of the National Medical Association and president-elect of SAM for diversity and inclusion in emergency medicine. Now let's welcome our panelists. Okay, so we're gonna go into our questions. Is everyone ready? Okay, so the first question is for Dr. L.A. Alvarez. Now, can you tell us what are the important considerations for inclusive messaging when there are crises and the stakes are high?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think as leaders, we often have the sense that we need to address them in our group, but also worry may inadvertently exclude people or potentially harm them or make them feel like they're not included in the conversation. So I think part of this is to understand our own intentions first. And within our inner circle, ask if these are valid. Like, hey, can I just have a real talk about something that's concerning me about? Because it may be that there is that we need to tease out more before sending out, like, especially if the messaging is in a written form, where people will look at it many times, start to find different nuanced messages, and then it'll backfire. At the end of this also, I think it's important to understand that we won't be able to please everybody, but so long as the intention is very clear and we're able to share that with people, I think that's very important. I'm going to be highlighting several of the pointers here that actually Dr. Kamna Balhara, myself, and several others have drafted for CORD in response to several critical events. And so the first one we talked about is knowing the intention. The next one is really understanding and also getting to know our own group. There may be multiple separate sessions that's needed to understand this, but it's okay, I think, to pause and reflect on this instead of just going with our emotions initially, which then can put us at risk of, again, like alienating other people. This may be a joint session, a couple of joint sessions, maybe a listening session. But if we decide that it's going to be a conversation, we have to be very clear about who's going to be in the audience, how are they going to be able to participate, and what are some guidelines on how we can create this discourse without making it such that one group or one person feels like they have to defend themselves to everybody. Another key piece of this, and something that we've looked into when we were planning this event, is to make sure that we get leadership buy-in. I think it's very important to collaborate with the different groups and stakeholders to make sure that they're also aware of what's happening and they can give perspective, because there are things that perhaps in my area of well-being or some DEI spaces that makes perfect sense, but in the bigger picture may not be as clear for other people. And so getting that buy-in early on is going to be very important. And then the next part is really setting that stage, establishing some ground rules and practices so that people know ahead of time what's going to be covered, what's not going to be covered, similar to what you just did, Dr. Adesina, when we started this event. Again, all of this is to ensure that there's psychological safety that is supportive of differences of opinions and also differences in the experiences that we may be having. And if we do have to share experiences, we have to make it a point such that we're sharing from a point of view based on our own lived experience and not generalizing it for everybody. Other ways to do this is engaging other people's expertise when we're messaging the group. But all of this, I think, is important to acknowledge when those high stakes messaging, inclusive messaging, are going to be important. And lastly, I think there's that respect for time. And so I also understand that each of us have some time here to share our opinions and also based on our experiences, but really creating that space for being able to share your time, your points of view, and also yielding the time for others to share their opinion. And so with that, I'm yielding the rest of my time for others to share their thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Alvarez. Those were very excellent points. I was taking notes. Excellent points. Any of the panelists want to add?
Sure, I'll chime in. Thank you, LA. I think you alluded to this as well, but depending upon the issue, I think it's important to realize who is most vulnerable, who's most impacted by whatever that crisis may be, regardless if it's local, global, et cetera, because those are the voices that we need to center during these times, because not everyone is impacted the same by a crisis, a policy, or some whatever the political or medical change may be. And I think that's important to decenter ourselves during these times and think about who's most likely to be negatively impacted by whatever the issue at hand may be, and make sure that they're in a place where their needs are being heard as well as centered. Dr. Gipson.
It's very important in making sure that their needs are met. Dr. Ordonez, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I wanted to definitely echo what both my colleagues, Dr. Alvarez and Dr. Gipson, said, that, it's important for us to recognize that, these crises can impact various communities and individuals in unique ways, right? And so what traumatizes one person may have little or no impact on another. So, being that we all respond to trauma in our own ways, there's comfort in knowing like, look, there's not just one way to react. And so we have to make sure that when we create our message, we create it with empathy. We have a respect for, everyone's lived experiences, and, that we engage, our colleagues without judgment. And at the same time, we also have to be cognizant that, it's the person's experience of the event and not necessarily, the event in and of itself that can cause somebody to be activated or feel harmed, right? So, sometimes you want your messaging to be general, but in certain instances, it may be necessary to do individual check-ins with individuals as they process this. And as Dr. Alvarez mentioned, at times it requires separate meetings, and that's where there's potentially strength in things like affinity groups, right? And another thing that we have to consider is, this question specifically about, what are some of the considerations that today, in today's digital age, like we have multiple venues for information to go back and forth. There's all this social media, and this misinformation can be, everywhere. So we just have to make sure that, our sources of information can be verified, make sure that we're preventing any further panic, any harm, and make sure that our goal in this messaging, whether again it's at a larger level, larger scale, or an individual scale, that our goal in the messaging is to foster solidarity, amongst our specific communities. And that could be, the academic departments, our institutions, our specialty organizations like SAEM and whatnot.
So much. So, just making sure that messaging is customized and not just cookie cutter, like depending on the situation, make it accessible and make it unique to that situation. Okay, so Dr. Davis, are there any questions or comments in the section so far? So we'll move on to our next, and this question will be for Dr. Ordonez. How do you approach messaging when crises arise? Walk us through the steps from contemplation to completion, how you approach it.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, because for many of us, and, this is not an easy thing to do, right? And sometimes you have to acquire a skill to address these messages. And, when there's a crisis, I think that you just have to make an assessment, one, about the urgency of the needed messaging, right? Is it something that needs to be addressed immediately, or is there something that maybe is less time constrained? So I think it's important, if possible, to do some fact searching, as I mentioned, given the kind of various venues of information out there. It's important to understand who are the stakeholders, right? So who are the communities affected, and make sure that you're inclusive of all those that are involved in whatever the crisis is. And also you need to assess the potential impact of these crises, right? So I think, this is a time where, you have to kind of reflect on kind of like your own knowledge, your own abilities, and, seek out help. So I think it's important to seek diverse perspectives when you're going to potentially disseminate any messages in your review process. So this could be from other colleagues, individuals who have lived experience that are, or have an identity that relates to the group, that's affected or whatnot. So I think, when we put together these communication plans, we first and foremost need to acknowledge that people are hurting at times, right? And so what can we do to create safe spaces for them? And I think that part of acknowledging people's emotions is really important. And, it really takes me back to a quote that I learned in this professional development course that I took that was about coping with traumatic events. And I want to read the quote. It says, "There's no moving onto healing and restoration without giving full expression to the grief and the trauma that we feel." And that quote is from Reverend Jason Coker. So, and it's a great quote. And again, in this messaging, I think that what we also need to be aware of is, we can't know it all. We talk about, having cultural competency in healthcare and whatnot, but I really think that's almost a misnomer, because it's really impossible to be completely competent in everything, right? And there's a lot of cultural nuance in many of the things that we discuss in this space. So you have to have humility and, be open to feedback from individuals in your community members, and just be ready to adapt messages, as things evolve in the situation, or as more information becomes available.
Thank you, Dr. Ordonez. You mentioned two things that really resonated. The first one is the last word you said, humility. So just understanding that we don't have the full perspective and we need to seek information and we need to seek insight from those that are affected. And the other thing is getting the skill, realizing that this is a skill. And how do we get this skill? I think one of the things is, starting from where we're starting, attending webinars, getting information, taking workshop, and acquiring that skill necessary to do that kind of messaging. Do any of our other panelists have anything to add to that question?
I can add that I think sometimes we worry too much about the message itself, that we filter it too much. And I think at the beginning, it's okay, so long as you have somebody else read that and make sure that it lands. I'll share with you an experience that happened in our department where something very private in one of our colleague happens. And so there was this message that was very vague, but again, the idea was to let people know that there are support systems out there, that we may not have all the details or the information yet, and maybe not even be allowed to share a lot of those information. And so what I struggled the most in that was that was a very authentic email that was sent by one of our leaders. But what I also realized that what it may need is a follow-up to just there's some facts or maybe not enough facts that we have, but to acknowledge what's happening. But then there's also the emotional component of this, that maybe for many people who may not yet know what's happening, we may not have all the information to share, but just trust that there are support systems. And again, emphasizing that the intention and the culture that we have, that we're here to support each other, and that if you are going through something, that there are ways to get support. I think that's important to message, so that when you do feel that doesn't apply to me, or I feel like that's a one-sided conversation, that at least that, as Dr. Ordonez pointed out, that there may be affinity groups, there may be other ways to get that community and sense of belonging addressed.
I think my colleagues raised some valid points. A lot of times, particularly as physicians or fixers, we are believed to be, authoritarians on all issues, and that's not always the case. A lot of times, certain issues will arise, and our goal is not to solve the problem. Perhaps it's out of scope for our department, for our individual or even departmental expertise to even solve. So a lot of times, it's for the purposes of providing acknowledgement, support, and for everyone to feel seen and or heard, but not to necessarily fix, and that's equally important as well.
Thank you, Dr. Gipson. At this point, we're just going to check. Are there any questions or comments?
This is Dr. Whitlow from the Bay Area, California. I just wanted to comment on the last two things we talked about. One is about recognizing all the different ways that different communities and different people may be affected by a trauma or an event or a crisis. I learned a very valuable thing from our system rabbi during COVID. We were all trying to do crisis communication across 6 medical schools in 5 or 6 states and in multiple campuses around the world, in Israel and Moscow and Germany and all these other things. We're an international system. And we were all talking about how we were all in the same boat, meaning that we were all experiencing the same thing. And the rabbi came to the executive team and wanted to remind us, I just want to remind you that while we're all experiencing the same ocean, we're not all in the same boat. Some people may be in a little dinghy or a little canoe, and some people may be in a yacht. And when you're communicating about this crisis, please consider not using the term, we're all in the same boat, because you're not. You have to take into consideration what everyone is bringing or experiencing in this crisis and how they uniquely are experiencing it. And for me, that was an eye-opening, or the light bulb went off in my head that I'd never even considered, that but saying everyone is in the same boat wasn't somehow excluding people and making people feel differently because of how they were experiencing the COVID-19 crisis and what was happening to them personally versus what was happening to us collectively. So this resonates with me, what you guys have been talking about. And I just wanted to bring that up, that the rabbi set us straight very quickly after the first few meetings to remind us to remember that basic tenet as we're implementing crisis communication, and think of it in that way. And that's changed the way that I have tried to communicate any type of crisis that I've had to communicate, whether it be local, whether it be school, whether it be a class, or whether it be at a hospital, or whether it be something larger. So I just wanted to share that because it's exactly in line in my mind with what you guys are talking about how everybody experiences this differently. So thank you. I appreciate the point.
Thank you, Dr. Willow. That was excellent point, acknowledging that we are all impacted differently. Before we move on to the next question, does any of our panelists want to chime in really quick on that or say anything? Okay, I have permission to move on. So we're going to move to the next question, and this question is for Dr. Gipson. As someone who may not be in a leadership role, I know we messaged this about those that are in leadership role, but that's for everybody, because whatever situation we find ourselves, we are going to encounter crisis, and we are going to come in a situation where we have to message and communicate and reach out to others. So as someone who may not be in a leadership role, what are ways one can contribute to inclusive messaging in times of crisis?
I think that's, an excellent question. When it comes to leadership, we get very invested in what your title is, but not everybody can be president. Not everyone can be chair, but part of being a leader is setting the tone in the culture. And this is displayed with our own behaviors. And I think that, you, depending upon your source or who you Google, there are numerous things of what it means to be a leader. And I'm going to allude to some of those set forth by Harvard Business School. The first one is your ability to influence others. I think it's important to show up as your authentic self for your students, your residents, and set the tone for, how we respond to certain crises, policies, et cetera, whether it be, at a global level, a local level, or even a hospital level. How you respond in your own demeanor, I think, is important as well. I think it's also important to be transparent. We alluded to humility. We don't know everything. You don't know the right thing to say, and that's okay. We may not have the authority to address a problem, but you should set the tone by making it clear that it's something that we can discuss and explore. I think it's important to also acknowledge that being a leader is about encouraging risk-taking and innovation. That doesn't require a title, but it means that you can create a safe and brave space like we're attempting to do in this webinar. Let people know that they can come to you without judgment, criticism, and you can be transparent in letting them know that you may not have all the answers, but maybe you can be the facilitator to get them to the right resources. In addition to these risk-taking and innovation, the next one is providing integrity and accountability. Do your words match your actions? A lot of times our organizations will set forth mission statements, or, we'll say that we, are dedicated to, TEI or whatever the case may be, but it's important that we hold ourselves accountable and that our words and our actions, whether it be in our department, within the context of our organizations, match the words that we set forth. I think it's also important to be decisive. Make sure that you are educated about a topic that doesn't require a leadership role, because it could affect your patients, it could affect your residents, or even your medical students. And also remember that silence is a choice. Does your voice need to be centered in this response? Maybe this isn't for you to talk about. Maybe your role in being a leader and setting forth a response is creating the space and for those who are most impacted to respond. I think it's also important to hold our leaderships, those people who are in leadership, accountable. Have they established a platform to carry out its objectives? And what are these qualitative and quantitative measures that we are ensuring our metrics are being met? And that's something that we sat and talked about before, like what does success look like? We can't please all of the people all of the time, but does everyone feel heard, respected? Do they feel that their voice is given equitable time and space? And if not, to what standards and remediation are we holding ourselves to make sure that the next time that something difficult happens, whether it be personally or at a global level, how have we improved? I think another thing that's important in these difficult times is to embrace the discomfort that comes with addressing these types of issues, whether it be policy, a cultural change, and considering decentering your immediate wants, needs, and privileges for the advancement of equity or the issues at hand. And the other thing that I kind of like to close with in addressing this, because we're all leaders in our own rights, regardless of what your title may be within your organization or in your department, is that remember, when you say or do things of consequence, you can expect consequences. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Make sure that you are using your voice, whatever that may look like, whether it's in the context of, your organizations, or for me, it's been writing, is understand that when you engage in a difficult conversations and address difficult issues, that there are going to be consequences, and make sure that you are prepared for that and are creating an environment where other people can maybe come to you for support when those consequences do arise.
Thank you. Does anyone want to chime in, the panelists?
Sure, I'll kind of reiterate some of the things Dr. Gipson mentioned. And I agree that, in these times of crises, it's really about centering the voices of those who are affected, right? And hold space for them. And, again, there's a variety of ways that you can go about that. And we discussed previously affinity groups or other potential arenas for discourse on whatever the topic is. And just as she mentioned, leadership in crisis communication isn't confined to having a title. It's a responsibility that all of us can take on, right? Regardless of how daunting it may seem. And for some of us, certain topics may be out of our comfort zone. But, we need to realize that, we all have the power to both amplify and diminish stressful events. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a skill that can be developed, it can be practiced on how one becomes a stress mitigator, right? And be on a journey from being trauma informed, so kind of understanding that trauma affects folks, to being trauma responsive and how we can, help people on their journey to healing. So I think that we have to look at it similarly to how we discuss, having a lens, right? We talked previously in other discussions about what it means to have a lens of equity. Well, we can also look at being trauma responsive as not like a hat that you put on, but just kind of a way that you move throughout the world, right? And I think, again, to lead in these situations, I feel that you just have to know how to lead in general. And it's not just about times of crises. I think that it's important to acknowledge, to celebrate, to amplify others when there aren't crises. And that's equally as important, because I think that when you do that, people will likely perceive your communication during crises as genuine and not as something that's performative. And that will lead to a real sense of inclusion and belonging to these groups.
I like that a lot. And I will add that in addition to this trauma-informed way of navigating the messaging, I think from a point of compassion, we can look at it from the three areas, right? So first one is self-awareness. Am I the only one feeling this? Or is this a shared common experience that people may have? We may not have the same experiences, but are the emotions that are surfacing something that we can acknowledge? And then the third part is really that also being kind to ourselves, because it's very common, even if you don't have a leadership role, to feel like you want to do something to alleviate that suffering that our colleagues are experiencing or that we may be feeling, right? That's part of compassion. And just even thinking about it, just even finding ways that you can reach out, that I think we have to be reminded that that is a form of compassion and not a form of not doing anything. And so maybe sometimes stepping back is important, but also I think it's important to understand that, believe it or not, being a leader can be lonely. So when that leader sends that email or that important message about a crisis, I don't know about the leaders, and I know there's a lot of leaders in this webinar right now. How many of you would be pausing and waiting for that immediate reaction? Did I send that right? Did I miss? They probably rereading that message 3 or 4 times to make sure there's no misspellings. If there is, they're going to be so critical about themselves. So if you were the non-leader, one thing that you can do is just simply text that person or email back and say, hey, thank you. Thank you for sending this email, because it goes so much more to be appreciated for braving those spaces where they may not feel comfortable addressing the issue immediately. But again, it creates this environment that we're all working together to create a better space for all of us.
Thank you so much for that. All the points were very kind of, it resonated. One thing I just want to add too, just to add to what's been said, is that I borrowed this from a famous author, but it's asking the people involved, when you're on the receiving end or you're the affected person and you are reaching out to your leader, realizing that, leaders, yes, they are people too, and they don't know it all, but kind of sharing them, what does help look like? What does support look like for you? What does support look like for your group if you're affected? letting your leader know how they can best support you. You know, I think that's something that's often not done on the other end. So that would be something too. Any questions? Dr. Davis, do you have any questions in the chat?
No questions in the chat yet, just
Huh.
agreeing points.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on to our fourth question. And this is for everyone on the panelists group. So as you know, as we are discussing, you know, different strategies and how we approach it, what are some lessons that you've learned over time? Discuss some successes and challenges, and even maybe share certain experiences with us that we can all learn from. Who wants to go first?
I can share that one of the big takeaways that I've learned, especially with messaging about critical events, is that it's okay to fumble a little bit so long as the intentions are very clear. And when I do fumble, that I acknowledge that. And also those groups or people that may have been impacted by that fumble, I need to address that. I need to work with them to make them not just the person who is feeling bad about it or feeling hurt, but also giving them that voice that maybe, you know what, I didn't consider that. I think it's very hard to do that as a leader, especially owning that vulnerability. But I think we have to be comfortable being in a situation, especially in emergency medicine, where we don't always have a lot of the information that we need to move on, but we have to do something because we also understand that sense of urgency that we have to address. So I've fumbled in some of my messages, and also those are probably one of the most meaningful conversations that I've had afterwards, and making a point to expanding not only my knowledge of gaps in my knowledge, but actually empowering other people to maybe lead some of these initiatives that I just don't have the good handle on yet. And again, as a leader, to also learn to forgive myself so I can continue to do the work as opposed to being subjected to feeling just badly about that one message that I sent. Because especially in bigger departments, bigger organizations, we won't be able to please everyone. But for me, so long as, again, the intentions are very clear, I've clarified that over and over again, and then ending my message with, this is the intent. And if it lands differently, then again, let's continue to have a conversation. It's not like a one message you send and then that's it. It's like, it's an ongoing conversation. I think that's one of the things that I've learned about this.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to allude to what Dr. Alvarez mentioned about, you know, fumbling too, because I've been there myself, and also about, you know, just well-being in general from this position of leadership, right? Because, you know, we're looking at this angle from, you know, the perspective of a leader, and that's, I think, a bit unique, right? How do we help others cope with crises? And how do we provide solace while at the same time, these events may be affecting us, right? And, you know, oftentimes people, you know, use the term, it's like a colloquialism, you know, protect your peace. And how do you do that? And there's not like an easy answer, you know, to that. But I think, you know, from other, you know, experiences in terms of successes and challenges, I think I look at these, and we can all look at these types of situations as opportunities, right? Opportunities for growth and learning. And, you know, because, you know, places of harm can become sources of wisdom, they can become sources of healing, and they can become sources of change, right? So they maybe allow us to make systemic change, you know, whether it's in our institutions or organizations or whatever it may be, you know. But it's also a time that, you know, we have to appreciate the vulnerabilities of others while, you know, also allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, which can be difficult because sometimes you may hear something that, you know, again, you fumbled, right? But we have to be willing to receive feedback, reflect on that feedback so we can, you know, also grow. But again, I just think it's really important to hold space, not just for those communities involved, but also for yourself, for your own, you know, mental well-being.
And you both made excellent points. And I think that in retrospect, I think that it's important to decenter your own privilege and perspective when we are addressing these issues of crises. A lot of times we make assumptions about how other people are impacting or even what their needs are from our leadership and our organization. Not every response requires that the issue be solved. A lot of times I think that it's important that we are just providing an environment in place of solace, of support, and of comfort, because maybe our own experience, our own lived experiences, maybe the tools in our toolbox are inadequate at addressing the issue, and we are making assumptions that whomever is most impacted by whatever the issue may be is turning to us for some sort of answers or problem solving, and that's not always the case. I think that as physicians, a lot of time we take a paternalistic role, and that can often translate into how we address other issues, and that's not always the case. So I think it's important that we humble ourselves and acknowledge that there are gaps in our knowledge. We don't have all of the answers, and we can't make assumptions about how people are being impacted and what their needs are from us in these issues of crises, and realize that sometimes, leadership is not from the top down, and to center others' wants, needs, and their lived experiences when it comes to making these type of responses.
Thank you, everyone. Those are excellent points. At this point, I'm just going to open up the floor to see if anyone has comments or questions. Dr. Davis, do you see any comments or questions?
No comments in the chat, but I think people are willing or able to chime in if they would like.
Any questions or comments at this time?
I would just like to echo, I think it was Dr. Ordonez who was talking about how we as leaders agonize over the communications that we create for crisis communication to large numbers of groups of people. I've had to do this many times, from when I was a medical director of a poison center to now a senior associate dean of a medical school, and all of these things. And it's never easy. And he's exactly right. I will read that email 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, revise it, sit on it, save it for an hour, go back and look at it, have someone else read that email for me to make sure that I'm communicating it in the best way possible to the most people possible, and not making any assumptions before I send it. And inevitably, I miss someone, or I miss something, or I get something wrong. And it really is good to get that feedback that I missed something and got something wrong. And so next time I get better. But I agree with him. Maybe it was Dr. Alvarez who was talking about that people who, as a non-leader, I didn't think about this when I was young as a non-leader in medicine, to actually send a thank you note to someone who spent that time, because now I know how much it takes to actually create these crises communications, and to thank them. And I think that that's a very good point that you made, Dr. Alvarez, to take that time for all of us, even if we are leaders, to leaders who are senior to us or other leaders in the institution, to remind them to say thank you, because I know how hard this job is, and I appreciate the time you spent and the message you gave us, because I think we all need to hold each other up in times of the co-leaders, other leaders, and people who are non-leaders alike, to hold each other up during these types of situations, because it can get really tough to be the only person or the person who's having to make all of these crises communications. So I just wanted to echo that and thank you for the points.
Yeah, I have zero doubt that if it's a negative thing, that leader is going to hear about it immediately, but the thank yous are probably very rare. I see Dr. Tansky's hand.
Yes,
Hi,
you're very right. Just like with patients or anyone else. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's okay. Hey, thank you for taking my question. It's Mary Tansky. Thanks for being here and for your time. I think one of the struggles that I have is, how we read our internal voice in emails, for example, or written communication is often different than how it may be interpreted by others. So I was wondering if anyone could comment on that piece. Maybe it's just having multiple people read it, or just, having some, varying views give you feedback before you send a communication. But the reason I'm asking in particular is I often get asked about, intent versus impact. And of course, LA, you mentioned that the intent is out there, and you ask for feedback about the intent, but can you maybe address both how you get that feedback before you send something, and make sure that it's written in a way that others may interpret, that you're not kind of just interpreting it from your own voice, and then also if there's a way that you address that intent factor so that it's not intent versus impact holding people back?
Yeah, very good question. And there's two parts there. So the first part is, how do I get other people's perspective? I personally agonize about those messages that I send to make sure like I don't miss things. And invariably I have several of these examples where even there's like typos, like crap, like I've read that many times, and then there's still like the typos. But I have a few circle of friends that I would send the email out if I really need that perspective, or at least like talk it through with somebody. And then in the end, I think I've been a director of well-being in my department for a couple of years now. And so people may tend to have a sense of how I communicate. And so as long as I'm in line with that, I think I can go with that. And so when I make mistakes, people also understand that like that is the way that I've been doing it. When I do something completely different, I signal that to people, hey, this is very different for me. And here's why. That way they're also not focused on the approach that I'm doing, but actually the message that I'm trying to give. And even with that, I will fail or I'm fumbling. And it's okay for me to also just acknowledge that like they may be reacting to the message, but not the intent, or vice versa. They may accept the intent, but like it landed poorly. And I want to know that. In terms of the intent versus impact, that's very hard. But again, I cannot control how my words are gonna impact others, but I can control at least by checking with other people. I can control how I can like craft the message enough with enough like empathy, such that like when I send it, at least I've considered different voices to be incorporated there. And then in the end, like I have to be able to stand with what I've said and be able to quickly either redirect, change myself, or apologize and move on. Because if I'm constantly worried about failing, then it's paralyzing. Then I won't be able to actually send those messages in such an authentic way that reaches people. I don't know if that is clear enough.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it can't be understated how important it is to, you mentioned, Dr. Tansky, about, the intent over the impact, and I think a way to try to mitigate that obviously is to get diverse kind of like voices in even your own, right? And I know that sometimes that can be difficult because some, crises occur and it kind of requires a specific time frame to be addressed or whatnot. But if it's possible, getting diverse perspectives and having others kind of look over your message, because you're right. And, I actually never thought about that. Like your internal voice sounds probably good and accurate to you, but, often, it may not to others. And while there may be an impact that is different from the intent, I think that what we have to try to create is this kind of like open space for dialogue, for discourse. Don't kind of leave your messaging as just that, but give opportunity for others to potentially, provide messaging themselves, be responsive to their feedback if they give you. And this may require, follow-up emails, whether it's for clarification or just to do another check-in. So a variety of ways, but I can imagine, that, it's difficult because, again, at least personally for myself, when the impact isn't what my intent was, I know that I kind of personally, take it to heart. And that's kind of where I have to make sure to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of protect my peace and make sure I'm taking care of my own well-being.
I think also that perfection is the enemy of progress. If you are aiming for perfection and, appeasing everyone, you'll never say anything about anything ever. And also just be transparent about what your intentions are and realize and acknowledge your own shortcomings, because I think as leaders, it's important to be humble and to recognize our own humility. We've alluded to this throughout the entire conversation, is that we don't have all of the answers. And not only do we not have all of the answers, we also don't have all of the tools of which to package our message. And I think that if you leave your response open-ended and let people know that perhaps your intent and impact doesn't match, then that leaves the room for improvement as well. And also for me personally, I try to never send an email when I am tired, hungry, or it's dark outside. Those are all things that could really have some sort of a negative impact on your mood, and maybe you're not conveying what you want to say because certain aspects of how you feel about a certain message are overshadowing what you really want your intentions and your impact to be.
Those are the top 3 takeaways for this webinar. Don't send a message when you're tired, hungry, or when it's dark outside.
Thank you. Any last minute comments from panelists or the audience?
I will just add that I think that we also, again, think of leadership as this perfect being or perfect role, and that we're not allowed to make mistakes. I will also temper that with that there are people out there in this country that have lost their jobs because of some of the critical messages that they've sent. And so how do we then navigate that? For me, I look at it as, again, so long as I'm true to my values, so long as I try my best in the efforts that I do, then if I lose my job tomorrow, then probably I shouldn't be continuing this job. But I also know that in the work that I do, I continue to make positive impact in the people that I work with. And if I can focus on that, then the mistakes that we do are simply part of us all growing as an institution, as an organization, in a very complicated environment, especially in emergency medicine, where burnout is very high, work compression is very high, and crises outside of the emergency department influence how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we see our patients. And so I just have to remind myself that.
All right, thank you, Dr. Alvarez. So I'm just going to summarize a few takeaway points that we heard from this very impactful session about how to message. So acknowledge the situation, acknowledge that we are impacted differently and it's not equal. We can't please everyone, but make your intentions clear. Be willing and be vulnerable and open to learning, understanding that you don't know it all. Create a safe space and engage all the stakeholders and people that are most impacted. Acknowledge that we're going to mess up sometimes and we're going to get it wrong. Grant yourself some grace and be willing to accept feedback and grow from there. All right, I want to just thank all our panelists and everyone who showed up today. Thank you so much for your time and your contributions. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.